as well. The survivors unanimously are contesting the accounts of the Greek Coast Guard, who say that they did everything they could to try and save as many people as possible. The survivors blame the Coast Guard, saying that they did not attempt to tow the boat to safety and leaving it to capsize. The incident took place at night and in international waters inside the Greek search and rescue zone, meaning Greece was the coastal state responsible for initiating the necessary search and rescue operations.
Christine's going out for a while.
So hi there, can we just ask everyone to mute again, just a reminder, please, thank you. So this is obviously a very, very horrifying disaster. As I said, we still don't have a clear enough picture of what's happened. We don't even really know how many people have died. We're also having this discussion following yesterday here in the UK, where Britain, Suella Braverman, the Tory Home Secretary, and her illegal migration bill passed, and it will now become an act. It's a horrifying piece of legislation, and our panel will be also talking about that as well. So this is the context in which we're having tonight's debate. And also there are record temperatures across large swathes of Europe as well. And we know that in the future, more people are expected to be fleeing the countries of origin based on the climate crisis, which is unfolding at a very rapid rate, and which we are seeing more and more on our screens because it's impacting Europe. But we know the climate crisis is impacting large parts of South Asia and also Africa as well. It doesn't get as many headlines, but this is a fact. So I'm going to introduce the panel. So we have Zoe Gardner, who is known to many of us here, and is a part of the Another Europe is National Committee. Zoe Gardner is an immigration policy expert and campaigner for the rights of all migrants and refugees. She's very prolific in her defense of the rights of migrants and refugees, and is on the media frequently. So Zoe, thank you for all your work. I know you do also come in for significant amount of trolling online, but you keep going, so thank you for that. We also have joining us tonight Sahar, Halaimzai, who is a Deputy Director of the Civic Engagement Project and Associate Researcher at the London School of Economics, where she co-leads the Afghan Research Network. So really pleased to have you here, Sahar. Thank you for joining us. We also have Tahir Imran Mian, who is an award-winning investigative journalist, and he's a consulting editor for the independent investigative websites Fact, Focus and Pakistan Aviation. I'm also very proud to say that he's a very dear friend and a very, very brave individual and a tenacious journalist. So we're really glad to have you here as well, so we can understand in more detail the perspective from Pakistan and why people are leaving Pakistan in particular. And I know there's been a lot of turmoil and upheaval there, as there has in neighbouring Afghanistan as well. So we'd like to get that context. But I'm going to start off by handing over to you, Zoe, just to get a bit more context and a framing for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaista. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it's always great to be on a panel with you in all the brilliant work that you do as well to counter racism in this country and across Europe, with Another Europe and through your other work. So it's really great to be here. Thanks everybody who've joined us for this important conversation. Charles Payton, could you possibly mute yourself? Just getting some background noise there. Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's great to be here today, but it is unfortunately not an uplifting topic, and it's not, and I usually try my best to at least end with some kind of positivity, and I will try, but I'm afraid that this is actually something that we should be upset about, and that we should maybe stay upset about and sit in those feelings. And while it shows the strength of the resistance to this, that we're coming together to talk about it, to talk about solutions, to talk about the future, I think there's also a part of us that needs to recognize that this is just a terrible thing and part of a bigger terrible thing. And at the moment, we're not going in the right direction. So it's been almost a month since the shipwreck, where, as Shaista said, probably around 600 people were killed. We won't know the number and we won't know the names. We'll never hear the stories of the people, not all the people who are on that boat. Their bodies will probably never be recovered. And that's a tragedy that we have to deal with as Europeans, and also that their families and loved ones will have to deal with for the rest of their lives. And while it isn't recognised by politicians across Europe or by the media across Europe for the tragedy on the scale that it truly is, I think that we here today can recognise that for each individual concerned.
Hello, motherfuckers. Fuck you, motherfucker.
That was helpful.
Motherfuckers, fuck you.
Right, sorry about that, Zoe. Luke, is there anything we can do to remove this person?
Oh, I've removed them.
Thank you.
All over it. Thanks, Luke. So anyway, apart from that disrespectful intervention, I think everybody else here probably feels quite strongly that this is a tragedy that needs to be marked and remembered as such for all of the individuals concerned. But one of the most horrifying things about this mass drowning that has occurred is that it's not even the first mass drowning that occurred this summer. And it isn't even the last mass drowning that occurred this summer. And it won't be the last until we change very fundamentally and very significantly and radically the policies that we have in place in Europe across the entire issue of migration. And that goes from refugee protection to more generalized migration routes as well. It's not over, but it does seem that to a small degree, there's some level of reckoning of the responsibility that the Greek authorities and the Greek Coast Guard have played in this tragedy this time. As Shaista mentioned, many of the testimonies of the survivors suggest either that the Greek Coast Guard failed to act where they could and should have acted to save lives, or even potentially may have taken action that caused the disaster to happen. And certainly what is very clear is that the initial story of the Greek Coast Guard has changed several times. And there is significant evidence, at the very least, that the Greek Coast Guard knew about the ship and knew its location and its situation for as much as 20 hours before the shipwreck occurred. And it is a given in circumstances like that, that a ship is in distress. And therefore it was the responsibility of the Greek Coast Guard to act, to enact search and rescue, and they didn't. So this is part of a wider policy, both by the Greek state and from European level, to let people drown at best, which is quite horrific to say, but at best to just allow people to drown, at worst to actively intervene in order to ensure that people drown. We know that this is the case with Greece. There is a huge amount now of evidence of Greek officials carrying out dangerous, life-threatening pushback operations. There's video footage of Greek Coast Guard officers putting families onto rafts and leaving them adrift out at sea. In any other circumstances, I think we'd agree that that would be called murder and would be investigated as such. So this is a wider web of responsibility, and shockingly, there has been, is it shocking? I don't know. There has been a failure by the EU to respond adequately and with the severity of the actions documented by these investigative journalists about Greek Coast Guard actions, both with the EU border guard Frontex, whether with their collaboration or with their tacit consent because they continue to operate alongside them, and an absolute failure on the part of the EU to initiate the measures that they should be in order to reprimand the Greek authorities for these actions. And I do hope and I do believe that there is a small degree to which that is changing because of this event and this tragedy. And certainly in Greece at the moment, in the last month, has seen public meeting after protest after public meeting discussing this issue. People are not going to take it lying down. They will not allow this tragedy to go unmarked, and they are continuing to demand answers even today. There's a huge gathering outside of the Coast Guard's office in Kalamata, protesting and talking about these issues. So we need to keep amplifying the work that our siblings are doing over in Greece to hold people to account for this tragedy. But as I've alluded to, it's not just Greece that is accountable for what's going on here. In fact, this is a European-wide issue, and it's part of a European system that prioritizes at all costs the removal and refusal and blocking of human beings from entering the continent. And part of that has been systemic pushback operations being ignored. Part of it is also the dirty deals that the EU has cut with countries outside of Europe to contain and return migrant populations. And obviously, everybody in this audience will be very aware that the UK is certainly a part of that trend. Our efforts to remove people and create deals with unsavory regimes in faraway countries to remove migrants are never out of the headlines, but in fact, they are part of a wider trend. One thing this government does not have is brand new inspiration and fresh ideas, much as it has a whole lot of cruelty and innovation in ways of how to enact them. But these ideas are not new. And the idea of paying poorer countries, more unstable countries, countries with undemocratic leaderships to contain, remove and return migrants, it has been ongoing for several decades now. And horrifyingly, the European response to the drownings has so far been to cut a deal with the government in Tunisia for 800 million euros, 800 million euros, with more promise to come, up to €1 billion to come to contain migrant populations there. And that's in a context where Tunisia has slid away from democracy over the recent months, where there have been racist pogroms towards Black sub-Saharan African members of the community in particular. And those have been provoked by leading politicians, including the president. So an unsafe country becoming another dumping ground for Europe's refugees at great cost to European people. And, you know, we've seen that literally play out in the last weeks with Tunisia rounding up migrants and dumping them in the Sahara, which is exactly the same in reverse as leaving families adrift on rafts in the sea, leaving people with no food, water, means of escape in the desert is just the same kind of murder. And in this context, it's no surprise that we've seen an increase in the use of the route from Senegal and Western Africa towards the Canary Islands, even though that's a much, much longer and more dangerous journey for these migrant boats to take. And there have been many more deaths and a significant increase this year on last of people attempting that route. So as ever with these policies, all that happens is that we displace people to more dangerous routes. When we try to shut down one pathway, we simply force people to take another, because people don't disappear, people won't disappear, and people move from where they can't live to where they can live. And so I think that brings us to the UK and the fact that today we woke up to news that the final defeats had taken place in the Lords, and the government has passed all of its necessary steps in order to turn the illegal migration bill into law. And I think that, especially in the context of this discussion, and I'm so glad that we're going to hear from Tahir, we had so many Pakistanis on that boat, apparently. And what I try not to think about too much is that had those people survived, many of them may well have had more connection to the UK than to any other European country, and they may have tried to come to the UK. And the idea that had they survived the waves, that we would have locked them in one of Suella Braverman's detention cells with the threat of sending them to Rwanda, which is obviously nowhere near where they come from or any connection that they might have, is particularly horrifying today. So all of that can make us feel pretty exhausted, and as I said, a lack of hope. I think there are a few areas where we have to find the hope where we can. So I'll just very quickly mention a couple before I finish. I know I've depressed everybody, but I hope that was what you're expecting. We have a couple of areas of hope. I know that the British left is exhausted, not only from 13 years of Tory rule and austerity, but also from a Labour opposition that, while it has some wonderful bright sparks in it, Shaista, I'm looking at you, a leadership that really seems to not represent the change that we so desperately need. But we have to remember that we are actually heading towards change, at least of some kind. And we do have an unbelievable opportunity to influence the Labour Party. It won't be what we want, but we do have an opportunity that for the last 5 years we have not had, at least, if not longer, to really try to impact a government in waiting, as it probably is, where things could be better, and we do need to hang on to that possibility, because we really need to take the wins where we can get them. The other good things, the Rwanda deportation deal is very much in question, having been ruled as not a safe country by the UK Court of Appeal. Of course, the government is appealing that again to the Supreme Court, but in the meantime, nobody will be sent to Rwanda. So while the illegal migration bill has passed, there won't be any impact of it in terms of removals. Nobody will be sent away. There will be impact in the sense of people being left in limbo on barges and in army barracks and so on. But for the time being, nobody will be sent to Rwanda until that appeal is heard. And that's something that we should take hope from. And I think that there are increasing movements that are genuinely making the links between the climate catastrophe and the migration rights movement. And that's something that we've all been talking about quite a lot for a long time, but I'm starting to see some real movement to take action on that front. And those links are vital and will be vital in fighting this for the future. So those are my few slivers of hope. And I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Shaista.
Thank you, Zoe, for that very comprehensive overview of what we're facing, but also for your 3 points there, which genuinely are about giving us hope, but also ensuring that we continue to build this movement. Another Europe is possible. We continue doing our work, and we focus more than ever on making sure that that work is connected, with, like you said, with our siblings across Europe and elsewhere. So the 3 takeaway points from the end of your presentation there: changes in process, the Rwanda deal is hanging by a thread, and increasingly we are seeing movements being built which are connecting the migrants' rights crisis with the climate crisis, and that's really important that we're seeing that. Sahar, I did say I was going to come to you next, but I'm going to go to Tahir first, and then I'll come to you. So Tahir, if I hand over to you now, thank you.
Thank you, Shaista. I think there is always hope in despair and in hard times, and I think Britain needs its a ray of hope, because you have seen a lot of so-called austerity and these horrible legislations, and the recent spat of what Tory government has brought to the country. I think it's just disgraceful. But I'm not surprised. Exactly same things they did when they were the colonial masters under Churchill government in India. And the history is repeating itself. I think the cruelty has changed faces, but its nature remains the same. I'm going to talk about more about like what drives people to these countries and what is the core issue there. A lot of these people who died in the Mediterranean, or who not just this incident, but over the years, many people have died. My wife's close relative also died on the same route. There are 3 types of people that I can categorize. I mean, it's a horrible thing to do, to categorize humans, but I'm just going to say it so that people can understand that not every migrant is coming to get your jobs. There are people who don't have a place. There are people who don't have another way to live. So the top of the category is those who are persecuted in these countries, the persecuted minorities, especially the religious minorities who are persecuted, the Hazaras, the Ahmadiyya community, and of course, recently some other communities as well, Christians as well, who face desperate, disgraceful persecution across the country. I'm just in March this year, Pakistan's Shahida Raza, a football player, a prolific sportswoman from Hazara community, died in the Mediterranean in hope of reaching a better future for the children that she left in Quetta. I mean, it's absolutely a disgrace where they live. The state fails to protect them. There are more Hazaras killed in Quetta than the animals slaughtered on the Eid or all the Eids together. That's a famous saying in Quetta. There is not even a road stop in Quetta where there is a Hazara killed. So now you can identify in Quetta, this is the place where X was killed, this is the place. So this is the sort of state of persecution in Quetta. Let's talk about like Ahmadiyya community. They are facing the record persecution that is enabled by the state. The state persecutes them because it declares them heretic and then allows the hardcore militants to go after them. So these days, their mosques are under attack. They were not allowed to perform their religious duties inside the four walls of their homes. That is allowed by the court, by the government. But again, the militants have heavy hands. So these people, they cannot work because people come and place stickers at their shops that do not buy from them. Otherwise, you will be heretic as well. They cannot wear the special clothes they have. That's the same case with Hazaras. They cannot, because they are easily identified by their faces, by the features, by the clothes they wear. So these are people who basically have no hope of living in Pakistan, not getting education, not getting a good job, not getting a better future. So that's the only hope they have, to sell everything. And it's not easy because a lot of these people who died, they took heavy loans and with the hope that these loans will be repaid eventually. And now those families who are grieving for the dead ones will have to repay those loans as well. That's a double atrocity on the same. The second are people who basically do not have any other means of joining people in these countries. So for example, if the whole family is there and the system says that an 18 plus guy cannot or girl cannot join as a family reunion case, so they have no way then to reach Europe or UK apart from giving this money to the smugglers. All of you have seen the iconic, the horrifying, the haunting image of that brothers meeting through those barbed wires. The one who survived and the one who came from Netherlands to meet him. So the one who survived this shipwreck was not eligible for a family reunion. His whole family is in Netherlands. He's from Syria. But the Dutch government was not allowing them. So they had no other way apart from this dangerous path that they took. And he survived. He was lucky one, he survived. Others were not lucky. So these are people who are basically, who could be eligible for family reunions, for other legal frameworks. But because the law discriminates them, recognizing that they have a case. So the family is persecuted, the father is, the mother is, the brother is persecuted. But because he is not under some criteria, he will be discriminated against. And then the third part is basically economic migrants who basically come for better future. They have swathes of areas, Shaista, Gujarat and these areas where people are in Norway, in Sweden, in UK, Mirpur as well. So these are where people wake up and they see the Brits coming, the Norwegians coming, and they spend money. So for them, it's the future they want, the future they cannot have. And even then, they shouldn't be thrown to the waves like that. If, for example, you think that person hasn't got a case of asylum in this country, there are ways to send them back. You do not let the ship sink because you don't want to host them. There are legislations, laws, but I think the Greek government's method of handling refugees has been long recorded. If you follow Turkish media, they repeatedly share these videos, these shots where they are firing warning shots and these dinghies, these flimsy boats. They are pushing the boats away. That has been recorded. I follow these routes very, very closely, and I have seen this many, many times. So what accounts these people are giving us, contradictory to the Greek government's accounts, are 100% correct, because there is a wealth of evidence against the Greek government's version, which is on the record. You just have to like pick up Daily Sabah of Turkey, the Anadolu Agency Turkey's, their video footage on Twitter. The video is there, the evidence is there. So I'm just going to finally say that I think what we are forgetting in this whole conversation is that people are driven out of their homes. People are driven out of their. I haven't spoken about like people who are coming from Africa. I don't know what their circumstances are. Of course, there is war and famine everywhere, but in Pakistan specifically, there are people who have no hope of living. It's either death or it's either a life that they don't want to live. It's a life of denial. It's a life of persecution. So they prefer to take this gamble, and there is no other choice for them. They are not coming here because they are happy. I have seen very, very wealthy families, very, very influential families, billionaires in Pakistan, have their money and they're migrating to Canada because they cannot live in Pakistan. And I'm not talking about one community, I'm talking about a lot of persecuted communities, even Christians I know, Hazaras I know, Ahmadiyya community members I know, who cannot stay in Pakistan. So I think that gives you a bit of context of why they are leaving and who they are. Their identity is the same because they find that Pakistan is not the safe place where they can live or grow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahir. And before we come to Sahar, I just wanted to ask you how this disaster was covered by the media in Pakistan. Was it covered comprehensively? Were there protests in the streets? What was the response?
There were two types of response. First of all, there was victim blaming. Of course, they were blaming that, oh, these people could have lived. You pay this much money to a smuggler. You could have opened a shop. You could have basically get a rickshaw or a taxi and drive and something like that. It's very easy to say, but if you give this example to Hazara, he will say, okay, I'll buy a rickshaw. Where I'm going to drive it? In Hazara Town, Quetta, which is a small place, how much money I'm going to earn? Nothing. And even there, they are not safe. There have been 2 major suicide attacks within the heartland of Hazara community in Quetta. And then there have been, like, initially it was a lackluster coverage, but that picked up, but there were no protests. There was nothing of sorts there because our media is very, very focused on political events. And thanks to the submersible, everything shifted. So I sometimes feel that the poor migrant, not in a bad way, poor migrant, could not even get justice in coverage because a billionaire was in submersible. So media thought that it's more important to kill his existence, to kill his death and every tragedy, and shove it in the backlog of the stories over there and focus on that. I wish there was a back-to-back coverage of the Mediterranean disaster that might have changed perception of people, even in the way that these governments want. But I don't know why there is no, I know why there is not, because ironically, the media works on these days on trends. So like in BBC, I used to work for BBC. In BBC, we used to have these 6 things. So what is trending, what is basically people are talking about. So they would not talk about things that matter. So it's the same in Pakistan. The media is driven by money and money is not in these issues.
Okay, Tahir, thank you so much for explaining that because we don't often hear from voices from Pakistan. We very seldom do, actually. So thank you for giving us some clearer context there. Sahar, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Shaista, and thank you everyone for joining today on what is a grim anniversary. I'm going to talk a little bit about why people from Afghanistan are taking these really risky journeys to leave the country. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what's happening in the country at the moment. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we got here. So since the military takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021 by the Taliban, millions of Afghans are facing a trifecta of human rights, humanitarian, and political crises. The UN World Food Programme described Afghanistan as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today, with some 22 million Afghans facing starvation. That's over half the population. After seizing power, the Taliban have severely restricted civic space, threatening, detaining, beating, disappearing poets, musicians, journalists, human rights activists, civil society leaders, essentially anyone they deem or perceive as their enemies. They routinely carry out disappearances, torture, and executions of former security forces, despite agreeing to an amnesty 2 years ago. At the same time, they have released a steady stream, pretty much from the first day they took power, of decrees or policies, at least 40 at the last count, that directly target women and girls, specifically their basic rights and freedoms. So today in Afghanistan, girls can't go to school beyond 6th grade, and they're constantly changing the curriculum that is allowed for the girls who do go to school, to cover subjects they deem acceptable. Their extreme limitations don't just deny women access to education, but also freedom of movement, access to basic services. That includes healthcare, employment. Women can't go to the park, they can't go to the gym. And they, about a week ago, decided they were going to shut down all beauty salons across the country, which was one of the very few spaces left where women could gather, but also be economically active. And essentially what we're seeing in Afghanistan is institutionalized gender discrimination and segregation. And there is one tiny glimmer of hope in that there is a strong movement, a global movement to recognize this as gender apartheid in Afghanistan, akin to apartheid South Africa. So women and girls in Afghanistan have no future. The rate of suicides are increasing daily. But these policies don't just impact girls and women, they impact men as well. Lots of men have quit their jobs at various institutions, either in solidarity or because they just can't carry out their work without their female colleagues. A recent decree stated that women could no longer work for international NGOs, and a number of NGOs shut down their operations, some temporarily, some permanently. That means that those men are no longer able to work and provide for their families. And because of the toll of war, some 20%, and I think this is a conservative number, some 20% of Afghan households are women-headed households. So denying women work, access to, freedom of movement actually means that these families and communities essentially end up destitute, homeless, and unable to feed themselves and their families. So when you're faced with that sort of reality, any one of us would make the choice to leave, because not only do women and girls and the vast majority of the country don't really have a future, they can't feed themselves. There is just no, the rate of acute hunger is astonishing. And I think it's really important to really talk about how we got here. I think often when people talk about Afghanistan, we talk about it we talk about it in these sorts of like this really far away place where, these sorts of things happen, men behave in this way, it's beyond reform. But that is, of course, very far from the reality. What is happening in Afghanistan today is, after 20 years of US, NATO, and international involvement in Afghanistan, at one point, there was 51 different countries represented in Afghanistan. So there's a global responsibility to the people of Afghanistan. And what is particularly jarring for me as an Afghan, as a refugee myself, and as someone who's been really involved in Afghanistan, that is really difficult to stomach, is the fact that before all of this happened, the Taliban takeover happened, we all raised the alarm. Women and men in country, women and men in diaspora, our allies, every single day, we're like, there is no Taliban 2.0, they will not materialize. This is not a peace deal, it's an exit strategy. And it fell on deaf ears, and a lot of us were called warmongers. And so that is, I have to say, really, really difficult to stomach. But we have had a very, very long-term involvement in Afghanistan, 20 years, which means that we have a responsibility, and a responsibility we're not even fulfilling to our allies, interpreters, soldiers, others who fought alongside the British Army and other British personnel. when Donald Trump announced the talks with the Taliban, the vast majority of Afghans would have supported a withdrawal. People were tired of the conflict. People were willing to negotiate and talk with the Taliban, but what they wanted was a responsible withdrawal, not one that handed power over to the Taliban, which is essentially what it did. But the talks, by its very design, excluded women, civil society, and even the Afghan government at the time. So they were negotiating things on behalf of the Afghan people and the Afghan government behind closed doors. So essentially it was a shady deal done behind closed doors, and now millions of Afghans are bearing the brunt of it, which is why they're making these incredibly difficult choices. You know, we haven't kept our promises to our allies. We haven't kept our promises to the very people that fought alongside the Brits, that allowed them to be safe. I work across the board with various Afghans. There are the very few Afghans who've managed to leave are in limbo, stuck in third countries, homeless, in hotels for 2 years, so their kids are being moved around all the time. And they're just left languishing, and there is absolutely no end in sight. And why do people take these sorts of really dangerous, risky routes? I think the truth is there aren't any really safe routes. The pathways that exist are incredibly cumbersome. The criteria are, most people wouldn't be able to make the criteria to be able to access these pathways. They're not fit for purpose, and people wait for years in third-party countries to hear if a decision has been made on their case. And some of the people I work who've made it to the UK, some of these people were handpicked by the British government to bring here. They are in an equally terrible situation. They can't work, they're constantly moved, and it's a real shame, I think, for our country to treat their allies and people who fought alongside them in this way. I think, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Sahar. And I'd just like to really acknowledge as well that both you and Tahir obviously live the reality of this crisis in a different way to how Zoe and I do. So I just want to acknowledge that, because it's very painful for you to speak in this way. It's a very personal issue to both of you. Also, I just want to say how lovely it is to have a sister from Afghanistan and a brother from Pakistan on the same panel, because both countries have very much been at the forefront of the so-called US war on terror. And we know that Pakistan has very much has facilitated the US war on terror. And we also know Pakistan is a country that has given sanctuary, albeit not always in the most welcoming of circumstances, just to be very clear, to millions of Afghan refugees for a very long time. So I just wanted to pick up on some of what you were saying there, Sahar, and Tahir, your points from earlier as well, because when we met last summer, Tahir, you were involved in working with an organization to help evacuate Afghans from after the fall of Kabul. And I was just wondering if you can just tell us a little bit more, give us a bit more context about some of the parallels that are going on in both countries. Because as I said, it's very rare to hear two voices, in the context that you both, are familiar with in this way, because we don't hear, Pakistanis and Afghans don't get a chance to talk and mix either, do they?
Yes, we have a very, very unfortunate history between both countries. The governments, especially as the Pakistani establishment or the Pakistani military, for example, has a very, very complex role and a very condemnable role as well.
Duplicitous, perhaps, Tahir?
Yeah. So it's not always the best of things. So I think that's what prompted me, because a friend of mine approached me to evacuate a group of LGBTQI members, part of an American group. So I report in aviation, so I have really good contacts in airlines, and I convinced the Pakistani airline to start flights. So initially it was just one flight, and that spread out to 12 flights, and we managed to evacuate over 5,000 people, or help evacuate through different flights. I worked with like all sorts of organizations, and that brought me the memories of what you used to tell me about the development world. It was a very, very surreal experience, because I was not in any disrespectful way. I was dealt with like these young white interns or executives, someone sitting in Malta on holiday and someone sitting in France in a cozy office, and they were trying to figure out what is Kabul, is there an airport, how to get out, and basics of that. So it was really, and then I think the dilemma of this whole situation was that Afghans wanted to leave. They had opportunities, but these embassies, the British embassy or the German embassy or the Swedes, all of them, they wanted them to come to Islamabad so they will process. And they were not happy to issue just a letter that they could show to the Pakistani embassy to get a visa. So getting a visa was the nightmare. And I have paid, I'm saying that I have paid on behalf of organizations, or organizations have paid up to $1,000, $1,500 for one Pakistani visa, which is free. So there is a whole black market that exists in Afghanistan and in Pakistan that facilitates this mafia. So Afghans were left to basically all of these means. They don't have that much money to pay. So that's where we basically came. I came to. But I'm just saying that showed me the sort of like discrimination and the disgraceful attitude of these occupiers. I will call them occupiers on Afghanistan, because the Americans and everybody, they occupied Afghanistan, and then they left like occupied, because they said, okay, we got our job done. We don't have enough money. Okay, you do deal with everything. We'll go, as Hillary Clinton said. So the human rights workers who were told to defend human rights, or the women rights worker who were told to become like the voice of weak and the voice of oppressed, and the policewomen and the women judges, all were left on their own. They had nobody to protect them, because in the hurry, in the 15 days or 20 days, they flew as many flights as possible. And it was a chaos in itself. So for example, a family that was supposed to go to Sweden went to a Turkish plane and ended up in Istanbul. It was a mess. It was the shoddiest job by the Western countries. And then genuine people who were actually in danger were left on the streets, and we had to evacuate them. By we mean me and the NGOs that were basically left to deal with that after the Americans wound up everything. And those people some of them are still stuck in Pakistan, and some of them are making their way through the Mediterranean, through Greece, through Italy, because they have no other hope of getting out of it. And the biggest scam in the fall of Kabul is this P2 visa, in the American visa. I'm sorry, I'm being blunt, because that's a false hope. So thousands of Afghans paid thousands of dollars to get visas to come to Pakistan to apply for P2 visa that never came. So, and the same is British. They announced that they are going to get thousands of people, and people are waiting for their visas. They went and paid for the visa fees, and everything was done. And some of them are still stuck in Pakistan, waiting for their appointments or waiting for their visas. I think the only slightly commendable job that was done was by the Germans and the Swedes. And it's so funny. It's so funny that how these countries see the migrants as digits. So they were sleeping till October, maybe November, and suddenly they realize, oh, damn, we have 1,800 quota of Afghans. We don't have enough people. Can we charter like 3 flights and get them to somewhere? So this is the lack of empathy. They have room to get people out. They are allowed to do that, but they were not. So this basically drives me really angry, because these people, some of them were really, really, really in risk. I remember a transgender rights activist. We evacuated her by asking the Argentinians to issue a laissez-pass, temporary passport. We got the passport, smuggled the passport to Afghanistan, got the visas, got them out. The moment they left, the Taliban came and killed the husband of the woman. And we told her as she landed, she was informed that this has happened. We evacuated a family whose child was born after August, and the child did not have a passport. So I'm telling you that nobody in the world, I don't know what people think in these Western countries, nobody sits in their home with a passport in their hand to go and plan to go in asylum, claim asylum. Nobody, not especially Afghans. They did not had any such plans. They were happy with their lives. We put them through this situation and they are still paying the price for that. I can name names of hundreds of people that are stuck in Pakistan and that are stuck in Afghanistan who are eligible for the evacuations and have a safe life in UK or US or many other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahir. And I think you've raised so many vital points there. And also you're really highlighting and giving us an idea of the incredibly brave work that, Pakistani nationals, Afghan nationals are doing, basically the job of governments, Western governments, making sure people have documentation at great risk, and also, making sure the most persecuted of those minorities are often offered literally a lifeline. So I do want to thank you, and Sahar, you and all your networks as well, for the work that you're doing. And I think also this story is not told very often. We're not hearing about how Pakistanis and Afghans and Pakistanis are working together in this way. So thank you for sharing that. Zoe, I want to come to you, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. So obviously, if there's anything you want to pick up in terms of what the colleagues have both shared, please do. But I also wanted to ask you that the EU is currently in the process of adopting a new asylum and migration policy. I'm going to ask you a really obvious question, but it has to be asked. Is there any hope of things getting better, or what's in the pipeline from the EU, and what kind of policies should Europe be adopting, and what is potentially possible for them to adopt on the horizon?
Thanks, Shaista. And thanks, Sahar and Tahir, those testimonies. I mean, it's just puts it so clearly what is going on. Shaista, if you don't mind, just before I talk about the EU Asylum Pact, but I think it's a really important point, and I should just give my sort of assessment of it. But I just want to what you two have been talking about is really sort of like, it gives me this feeling so strongly. The government and the people who are opposed to protecting refugees and protecting migrants and treating them with equality and dignity, they so often use these scapegoat countries. So currently Pakistan is one of them. They're saying, oh, well, we're seeing an increase of asylum seekers from Pakistan, and Pakistan is a safe country. Of course, exactly as you've explained to us, Tahir, that actually is not necessarily the case, certainly not for everybody. But that isn't the point, because the point is that lie doesn't matter. That lie is just a mask, because look at how they're treating Afghans. And nobody pretends for 1 minute that Afghanistan is a safe country. And there are still no routes for them to escape. This is the same for Sudan. Nobody can pretend and say, well, actually, it's a safe country and they shouldn't be coming here. So given that we are treating people from Pakistan and from Albania, which is, of course, has been the other scapegoat country, and people from Afghanistan and people from Sudan just as cruelly as one another, it is nothing to do with even a false perception that these countries are safe. And it is simply a deflection tactic that is used to great effect in the media and by politicians. And the proof of it is that we treat people who are very, very obviously refugees under the terms of the convention equally to those who also may be, but who it's not so clear in the public mind that they may be. And on that, I think that the point you made about, some people genuinely making journeys out of economic motivation shouldn't be overlooked either. Poverty is still a danger in my book. And the reality is that we have an immigration system across Europe that is predicated on wealth. I mean, just, in the last week, we've heard that the government in the UK intends to increase the fees charged on everybody with a visa, double them. There is no route to migration for people who are not wealthy. Safe migration, be they refugees or be they people who are escaping from poverty and from a lack of opportunity. And it's my strong belief, the strong position of another Europe is possible, and I'm sure the position of most people here with us today, that, you know, being born in Europe does not entitle us to greater opportunity. It certainly doesn't entitle us to greater safety, but it neither does it entitle us to greater economic opportunity. So I think that there's a need to re-examine, especially we need the labor. I mean, I hate to make arguments from that perspective, but we really do need workers. And if we didn't limit the people that we allowed to come here to workers who already have elite qualifications and globally speaking, extremely high salaries, we would be benefiting everybody. And I think that's something that we should really try to remember as well in these conversations, is that the fundamental issue of justice is about, you know, the needs of the people who live in the countries that the UK is in part responsible for disaster and poverty, but also we would all benefit hugely from a more open migration system. And to that, the EU Asylum Pact, which is not a more open immigration system. So at the current time, there is about a year for the European Union to pass its pact on migration. They have had the Commission position put forward, the initial position, which was disastrous and terrible. The Parliament has now had its negotiations and has had its say. The Parliament amendments to the Commission document are probably as good as you could possibly hope for in terms of, you know, the starting point that we were at. And next step is for the Council to agree its position. And so we are likely to see a regression again to remove some of the small safeguards that have been put in place by the Parliament, and to make this legislation again more about keeping people out and less about sharing responsibility for responding humanely to migration. I mean, there are ultimately, nobody here will need, it's nothing new to anybody here. It codifies a lot of existing practice in terms of limited access to seek asylum. Here in the UK, we've obviously wiped out the right to seek asylum for anybody arriving spontaneously. The EU Migration Pact similarly very much limits the possibility of somebody arriving spontaneously at Europe's borders to apply for asylum. It entitles, if not requires, the detention automatically of everybody in border zones, permits refusals without consideration of asylum claims. It involves data collection, including fingerprinting of children as young as 12 years old. It includes the mass detention and systemic detention of people under those circumstances as well. There are small areas where there is an attempt to balance that with more shared responsibility between European member states. So it's this constant sort of battle where the more powerful, richer Western member states agree grudgingly to take on a bit more responsibility for people who arrive at the border states, but in exchange, the border states get harsher penalties to be used, more powers to refuse people, and more powers to push people away at those borders, so as to mean that the responsibility sharing is as meaningless as it could possibly be, because fewer and fewer people will ever reach. So unfortunately, that is the picture. It's being carried out under the new Spanish presidency of the EU, which is good in that Spain is, relatively speaking, a very left-wing government in Europe. Unfortunately, they have an election in a week or so. That could go either way. It really could. I'm not an expert on the Spanish political situation, but from what I understand, it really could be a sort of reformulation of the left-wing coalition we have now, arguably even to the left's advantage, or it could result in the Partido Popular, the Tory equivalent party, regaining power in Spain, which would obviously be utterly disastrous. And I do think that a lot of the outcomes of the EU pact negotiations will be impacted by that potential change in leadership in Spain. So it's one to watch. Certainly that election, I think it's on the 25th of this month. And I'm sure that another Europe will be commenting on it and following it as well with some analysis. And I think we should probably, get some Spaniards in to talk about that at some point as well. But yeah, so I mean, it's a rush. A lot of people argue that it would be better actually if they failed to pass this. In 2024, the parliament ends and there'll be new European elections. If they don't pass this pact by then it just all falls to bits and they'll have to bring a new set of legislation in the new parliament. A lot of activists believe that would actually be preferable because the measures of the pact are largely regressive and largely codify regressive practices that are already in place, and that might well happen. Yeah, so that's where we're at on that front. Any questions, of course, I'd be happy to answer, but I do also recommend for anybody who's interested in reading further, and I can find the link, the European Council on Refugees and Exiles have published a lot of short, clear to the point analyses of the EU Pact and what its impact will be. So I'll find a link for you now and put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you as always, Zoe. If anyone's got any more questions, please can you put them in the chat? So Sahar, we've got a question for you. What do you think about the shocking video produced by Tobias Ellwood, Tory MP, about the Taliban, which really felt like it crossed a line and the move to normalize relations with the Taliban in general?
That's a great question. I'm really glad somebody brought that up because it has been. Well, I personally think that is part of a trend that has been happening for even the talks with the Taliban to normalize and really push this narrative of a Taliban 2.0, which really sort of took hold. And a lot of experts outside of Afghanistan really ran with this idea of a Taliban 2.0. And there were, hundreds of panels and lots of expert papers and lots of op-eds that were written about. I had tea with the Taliban and, they didn't mind that I was a woman from Norway. So, in that way, to me, it's very not at all. It's just part of a trend of saying, okay, I think this kind of culture of normalization actually kind of works across the board, whether it's here in this country where we paint over some cartoons in a kids asylum and it's just slowly normalizes this kind of deep dehumanization of other people. I mean, the tweet itself, he released the video with a tweet. The tweet itself I thought was incredibly telling, and he should have probably had people read it before he sent it out. But I think it's also just he realizes the risks are so little. There's so few consequences for him. But essentially, he says there's no corruption. He's gone. The security situation is great. And given that the Taliban were doing a lot of the killing, it makes sense. And there are different forms of security. Not being able to leave your home because you're a woman is a form of insecurity, in my opinion, and many others. There's no corruption, but I don't think the Taliban would have taken him to the prisons where they're keeping people, have disappeared, education activists like Matiola Wessa, who's been in prison for 4 months simply for calling for girls' education. And then he says, there's no point shouting from afar for women's rights, which I thought was the most telling part of it, because the vast majority of Afghans, there are young women across the country every day protesting Taliban rule and fighting for their rights. So I kind of wanted to be like, who are you talking to? Because it's not the people that I'm talking to. But I think it's outrageous and needs to be challenged at every turn. I think that MPs shouldn't be able to take jobs as fanboys for de facto authorities like the Taliban. I think that's unethical and shouldn't be allowed. And I think that it's incredibly short-sighted, because even when you look at it from the perspective of, what does the situation in Afghanistan mean for the world? Pretending that this sort of extreme repression, this sort of that's enforced by violence won't have spillover effects and won't affect, millions of refugees in Pakistan, that has impact there, refugees in Iran, that has impact there. I think pretending that those things aren't going to impact all of us is actually just incredibly short-sighted and just bad politics.
Yes, Sahar, very much so, very bad politics. And also it's, I was born and raised in Britain. My heritage is in Pakistan, but it never fails to amaze me how disingenuous so much of the political thinking is around Afghanistan and Pakistan, and how little is known about both countries, and this very romanticized view of the reality on the ground for the average person, which obviously is not nice in any shape, way or form, which is a very mild way of describing it. Another question we have here is it a fact or simply media coverage that a significant majority of people arriving in this country, particularly in the boats across the channel, are young men? If this is in fact a predominance of young men, can you explain this? So Tahir, I was wondering if you want to start first with answering that and then moving on to you, Zoe, as well.
I think that's wrong to say that they are young men, because there were children, there were women as well in these shipwrecks, but mostly the families, for example, the communities that I spoke about, the persecuted communities or whatever, their most prized or possessed commodity is their youth, and they are the one who basically are the hope. So they want to save them because they think that they have spent their life and they don't want to basically go and live in another country. So they want to basically send their children. So I would not say that it's not true, but I don't think that you can generalize it, because these are the youngsters who want to build a new life. And as, for example, your father, Shaista, maybe, or somebody else who came to these countries when they were young and they had hope of building a better future. So yes, they're like, it's very difficult to say. But for example, when I talk about Shahida, the footballer, she was not young, but she left a young family behind. So it depends on who could do that. And I was watching a video yesterday, I think it was a DW video, where a 14-year-old boy was filmed and he died on the same tragedy. So his father collected money, and he told his father that send me and I'll change this fortune, otherwise we will just die poor. So it's predominantly because they have more resilience, they can endure more hardships, because you have to understand that a lot of them do not come on planes. They have to walk the treacherous path from Iran to Turkey, and from there to Egypt and all of that. Or sometimes they just come to Egypt and then by road they go to like in Libya. So the younger you are, the better chances you have of surviving. So I think that's very obvious.
Zoe?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Tahir. That's all. Yeah, I would totally agree with that assessment. I mean, in terms of the figures, yeah. So we have roughly, in terms of spontaneous arrivals in the UK, and this is mirrored across the EU, is about 2/3 men and 1/3 made up of both women and children. However, 99% of beneficiaries of family reunification policies are women and children. So as Tahir mentioned, when you're talking about an unbelievably dangerous journey, there are some additional dangers that face women and children on those journeys, unfortunately. Horrifying as the journey is for anybody, there are some very specific threats to women and children along that route. And so it is very often the case that the one considered strongest, as Tahir said, is sent with the intention that then they will be able to either work and send back means of support for their family members, or even better, reunite the family through then safe and legal means that are available, or that have been available until now. For people, once they are recognized as a refugee, they have the right to bring very limited family members to join them in safety in the UK and in Europe. That's the case. Under the illegal migration bill that just passed, of course, that will no longer be the case. And actually, family reunification, when you're talking about safe and legal routes, is the most effective safe legal route for people to come to safety in the UK. It's by far the most significant in terms of numbers. And again, obviously, it has many advantages, including not denying people agency, not turning people away who have made dramatic escapes. One of the stories from the boat that sank of Pylos that really stuck with me, because we have heard too few of the stories of the individuals on that boat. But one of them was a man. He was, I think, in his late 30s, maybe 40s, he's a Syrian, and he did what you're supposed to do, quote unquote, with his family when they escaped from Syria. They went to their first safe country, and they ended up in Jordan, and they were in a refugee camp for the last 10 years, having escaped the war in Syria, waiting for the hope of resettlement to a safe country. He had several children during the time that he was in that camp, including his youngest son, who is now 4 years old. That son was diagnosed with leukemia. And that's why at that stage, after waiting for 10 years in the first safe country, that man decided to take the journey, decided that he had no choice but to take the journey to Europe, either to be able to bring his son to a country where he would be able to be treated for leukemia, or to be able to send back the money in order for his family to be able to afford the treatment for his son. And unfortunately, that man died and was drowned on that journey. So when we talk about men, and I understand that the question doesn't come from this perspective, but it is too easily used to discredit people's stories. Male skin doesn't repel bullets. It doesn't protect one from torture. Men are actually victims of all the same abuses, including sexual violence, as women are. And they can most certainly be refugees. And very often they hold the additional responsibility of being responsible for the well-being of their families and their communities as well, in ways that are of course shared by women, but yeah, the men are the ones who can or are perceived to be able to get that economic security for their families.
Thank you. So Sahar, I saw you nodding. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Zoe, you actually responded from that perspective, because I think we do need to question why we think that, you know, young men are any less deserving of safety and a life free of violence and a second chance. I think that's a really, I think that's such a normalized narrative that it's really good to actually, you know, these are human beings who deserve to live in freedom and safety. And I think we need to think of them in that way.
Yeah, very well said. And thank you to the person who asked the question as well. As Zoe says, we know the question was not framed for any reason other than asking the question, and it's also enabled the panel to put these very important points across. We've got another question around the climate crisis. And there's a possibility of 2 billion migrants expected globally to be on the move in relation to the climate crisis. So the question is really asking about what can be done to help people, but also asking really about is it time for there to be an international convention on aid to countries affected adversely by the climate crisis. I'm going to go to you first, Tahir, because as we know, last summer, large swathes, I think 1/3 of Pakistan was under floodwater, and the climate minister, Shari Rahman, who we both know, was very, very clear. She said it was a climate super flood, and the UN said the same thing, and she demanded that there is proper money put on the table for Pakistan to deal with this. Obviously, that money hasn't materialized as yet. So in your work and from what you've seen, Tahir, how is the climate crisis impacting the issues we're talking about? I mean, we've both visited Sindh, which is the agricultural heartland of Pakistan, and temperatures already in the last 5 years have hit 50 degrees, which is just unbelievable. But the temperature is due to go higher this summer, isn't it? So what do you think the Western countries need to do? What does Pakistan need to do? And how is this impacting the issue around forced migration?
I think you have to look at it, for example, what's happening with Tunisian deal with European Union. Imagine if this deal was done way before, when they were selling weapons to the African regimes and the regime in Syria and Libya, or when they were invading these countries, they thought about that, how they are going to destabilize this region, and then there will be consequences. So it is time for these countries to think now that their impact. For example, the major contributors to global to climate crisis are these Western countries, where the majority of the fossil fuels are consumed, where majority of the emissions are coming from. Of course, there are targets and they are meeting those targets, but they have to also look that, for example, Netherlands is a small country. It can meet its targets, but the area of impact is not just Netherlands. Europe as a whole or West as a whole has major impact because they have benefited from the industrial revolution and the fossil fuels and all of that. So I think what we need to understand is not just giving aid to Pakistan or Bangladesh or these countries. They need to basically work on systems in development of infrastructure, because if, for example, the money is handed out to Pakistan or some countries as aid, that will be wasted, or that will not be used appropriately as it has been done in the past. So the West has to come up with a globe. I think not just West, the whole world has to come up sort of like a collective strategy, just the way the deal in Paris was, that they have to make sure that these targets are not just for specific countries. Countries that are not meeting targets, they should be asked what sort of support they need, and the money is put where the need is, whether it is infrastructure development, whether it is development of areas where these people could internally move. So, for example, if you see, there are a lot of floods in northern India and northern Pakistan these days. You see flash floods, trees ripped apart, roads are destroyed. And that is going to affect a lot of people who will move from those areas. And some of them might not want to move within Pakistan, or might not want to stay within Pakistan because they think that they have to uproot themselves. Why not uproot it completely? So things, for example, if you want to talk about like the point system, the so-called migration point system, maybe something like that for climate crisis affectees. But as a whole, I think reparation is one way of looking at it, which I think is fine by what Sherry Rahman was saying. But I believe that without a cohesive strategy where you take China on board, where you take India on board, because what's happening now is that these countries are focusing on targets and climate crisis deals and stuff like that. But India and China, for example, are not following on that as they should be. So we have to balance it out, because without a cohesive international strategy, maybe led by UN or some other body they want to create, it's not going to work. And this is bound to happen. I don't think that any mitigating measures will stop these 2 billion migrants from coming wherever they will find space.
Thank you, Tahir. And Sahar, obviously Afghanistan has been suffering and struggling in similar ways, landslides, floods, many other things as well. So is there anything in particular that you want to highlight in relation to what should be, now being done policy-wise?
I mean, yeah, Afghanistan is, I think one of the really important things to remember in the climate conversation about Afghanistan is that it's one of the lowest, it contributes the least to climate change and is one of the most sensitive countries, partly because they don't have the infrastructure. But I mean, in terms of, there are some really basic, there was a lot of thinking and work being done over the last 20 years to respond to some of these issues, particularly for a country that depends so much on agriculture. But of course, under the de facto authorities, it's not an area the Taliban think are particularly significant or important to look into. And one of the things that has happened is that a lot of the external funding to local communities that were coming up with solutions to their own local needs has stopped. And that is at a very sort of first step, basic level. One of the things that the international community should be talking about is how do we restart the funding to those local communities? And there is loads of humanitarian aid development work, aid delivery that's being done that goes over the Taliban, not through the Taliban. So how do we make sure that we restart funding to those local communities?
Yeah, Zoe, do you want to add anything around the climate crisis in particular?
Thanks. Yeah, and brilliant responses against Sahar and Tahir, saying so much of what needs to be said. I think one of the things that we need to sort of think about it as is migration is the most effective adaptive human behavior to the climate crisis. It's not a problem caused by the climate crisis. The climate crisis is a problem in and of itself. Migration is the solution in many, many, many cases. We need to see it in those terms. I also am, and I'm very much not an expert on climate technologies, climate issues, and how to reduce the speed at which the climate is changing. What I am, and I think that this goes to, and a lot of the discussions we often have in Another Europe about migration also, brings up this perspective of what we've done to contribute and how we need to stop fueling wars and selling arms and exacerbating climate catastrophe in countries of origin. And I 100% support that and agree with what's been said by the panelists here. But I also believe that a lot of those impacts are already underway. And a lot of it, it's definitely beyond my abilities to think of ways of providing real solutions. And in the meantime, we must recognize that a lot of people will move, even if we were to stop selling arms tomorrow, which I think is very unlikely. And if we were to decarbonize our economy on the even the unambitious scale at which we have made pledges to do so, which I don't believe we will, even then, huge amounts of people will be displaced by climate catastrophe and by ongoing instability and the cycle that is fed through that. So I think we need to try to reframe this as an opportunity for the people who are moving and for the people who will be in countries that are able to receive them. When we say numbers like 2 billion people will be displaced, it sounds terrifying, and it is terrifying. It has to also be managed, and it can be managed at this stage still in ways that will benefit all of us massively. We can rebuild our societies to be more resilient and to allow for probably at best some much more significant seasonal migration, if not more permanent migration as well. But that places matter, and maintaining the safety and security of people's right not to move is important. But where it cannot be achieved, and I think there are places in which it cannot be achieved, then we need to look at their movement as the massive opportunity and survival behavior that it is.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. So we're coming towards the end of our time together this evening, and obviously we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked a lot about the policies of the EU. We've talked about geopolitics, particularly Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've also talked about the climate crisis, which in itself is a massive area to try and analyse. But I think what the panelists have really done this evening is give us a lot to think about, and also make us understand that all these issues are interconnected and interlinked. And I know that most of us here knew that already. However, I think the way we frame these issues and the language we use is also really important. And I think, as Zoe said at the beginning of the discussion, it really is important when we're doing this work around creating justice for migrants, that we also absolutely centre it in the climate justice movement as well, because the issue around the lack of rights for migrants is only going to get worse unless there is a massive change in attitude and, frankly, upholding of human rights in Western countries and alongside the countries from which people are fleeing. But I think it's very important for us to really start doing more of that work as people who are part of global movements. And I just really appreciate all the expertise each of you have brought this evening to this discussion, and indeed everyone who's asked questions as well. So what we'll do is we will sign off for now, but you can find out more about Another Europe's work on our Twitter feed, also on our website, and please join, please participate. The movement has been growing over many years, but there's a lot of work we need to do, and we want to try and diversify this movement as much as possible. So again, thank you everyone for a really powerful evening of discussion and debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it was an honor to be on a panel with all of you brilliant people.
Thank you, Zoe, as
Thank you.
always.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everyone.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.